this whole perplexing issue of weight gain and why the majority of adults in the Western world are overweight or obese, and why metabolically people are extremely unhealthy in the Western world, and all the metabolic related syndromes. So we have this whole catchphrase called metabolic syndrome, which encompasses like 35, 40 different disease conditions, right? That includes diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, polycystic ovarian syndrome, like all these things that are seemingly unrelated to one another. You might not think Alzheimer's or heart disease has anything to do with one another, but they do. They have very similar origins, right? You may not think diabetes and polycystic ovarian syndrome has anything to do with one another, but they do. They have very similar root causes. All of these things are dysfunction of the metabolic system, weight gain, and having high adiposity. High adiposity means higher amounts of fat deposition, and that can be in a couple of different areas. One area is, of course, the subcutaneous fat. That's the fat in the kind of the under layers of the skin that you see distributed throughout the body, which gives a big body mass. But then even more dangerous fat is the visceral fat, and that's the fat around the midsection, right? So, and this is the fat that actually confers the highest amount of inflammation and metabolic disruption. So you've got this visceral fat that drives a significant amount of disease risk, and you've got the subcutaneous fat that's distributed throughout the body that can also cause some illness. But the visceral fat is very, very important. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we've been spending billions and billions of dollars every year for the last several decades on all kinds of weight loss solutions and ideas and diets and exercise programs and all that. And yet the obesity rates keep increasing. So then it was hypothesized that there's a missing link here in the thinking around obesity. And as you mentioned, the thinking used to be simple: calories in, calories out, willpower, don't eat the cupcakes, don't eat the donuts, choose a broccoli and work through that willpower, and then, burn enough calories at the gym, more so than you're taking in. And that should be the solution, right? But it's not for many people. It's a lot harder than that, because there's some fundamental things happening in their bodies that aren't really allowing them to gain the response that they assume they should gain from simple watching what they eat and burning more calories, right? And this is where the programs really fail, because a lot of people should start to lose weight in a noticeable fashion just by watching what they eat and increasing their activity. But there's a good portion of people that don't see much response even from doing that. And that may be because of some fundamental missing link. And that's where that missing link came in, is the role of the microbiome with weight management, right? And some of the early studies on this are now more than 10 years old. And what they were looking at is what we call discordant twins, right? So discordant twins are identical twins. So they have exactly the same genetics, in the same household, raised in with the same parents, eating the same thing. But one twin is obese and the other twin is lean, right? So then the question is, how is it that they are so different biologically, even though the genetics are exactly the same, the environment's exactly the same? So then the hypothesis was there may be a difference in their microbiomes, right? So there's been a number of studies where they take genetically identical mice, they feed them a given diet, right? Just a staple amount of food every single day at the same time. Then they take microbiomes from the skinny twin versus the obese twin, and then they implant those into different sets of mice. The mice that get the obese, that gets the obese twin's microbiome, always gains weight. And the mice that gets the skinny twin's microbiomes always stays lean, right? And this is feeding those mice the same exact diet, and it doesn't matter what you feed them. So then you can actually, they actually do studies where they cross it over, where they take the obese mice, they obliterate their microbiomes by antibiotics, and then they put the lean twins microbiome in the obese mice, and then they put the obese twins microbiome in the lean mice, and then they see a change where the lean mice now become obese and the obese mice now become lean, right? And again, they don't change anything about their diet at all. Right. So this was early indication. There was lots of variations of this kind of study, early indications that there are things within the microbiome that seem to dictate whether or not this animal is going to gain weight or stay lean, and it's not diet related. right? Meaning it didn't matter that both sets of mice were eating the same amount of calories, the same amount of food at the same time each day, right? So how your body responds to food makes a big difference on whether or not you stay lean or you gain weight. And there are a certain percentage of people, and I would say it's probably a higher percentage than we think. It's probably 40+% of people within the population that really will struggle where their body has a microbiome that's a pro-obese microbiome, right? There's a pro-lean microbiome and a pro-obese microbiome. And I think a large percentage of people have that pro-obese microbiome due to a few factors, right? So we can dig into what some of those factors are. So for example, when you look at the microbiome of obese individuals versus lean individuals tend to have high levels of organisms like Akkermansia muciniphila. Akkermansia muciniphila is inversely associated with obesity, diabetes, cardiometabolic disease, and low-grade inflammation. These are the main things in that whole metabolic syndrome category, right? When you have high levels of or good levels of Akkermansia, you tend to be lean, you tend to not have metabolic disease. If you have low levels of Akkermansia, you tend to have elevated risk for obesity and metabolic disease, right? So Akkermansia is a mucin degrading commensal bacteria. It lives deeper in the mucin layer in your intestine. It's demonstrated to be able to reverse high fat diet induce fat mass gain, right? So they've been able to do this on animals where they take animals and they feed them a really high saturated fat diet over a period of time. And these aren't good fats by any means. And those mice will gain weight over time. And then they start getting engrafting in Akkermansia into these mice while still feeding them the diet, and the impact of the diet gets reversed, right? So these mice actually stop gaining weight, and then they start to lose weight as well, right? Now
Can
this
I
was, yeah.
ask a real quick question? Did they ever test whether the appetite and the propensity for the mice would actually eat more or eat less as the microbiome changed?
They did not, and part of the reason for that is because if in order for them to test that, they have to give mice full access to food, right? Which means that if they want to eat more, they should be able to eat more, and then they have to measure how much more they eat. The problem with a lot of these animals is they'll eat as much as they're given, and so it kind of throws off the whole study when they do that, right? But we know in terms of appetite suppression, there are studies on appetite suppression in humans, and that has to do with the microbiome as well, which I'll touch on
Okay.
moving forward. The other, so keep in mind Akkermansia, right? So it's a keystone species having good levels of Akkermansia, protects the lining of the gut, and is also associated with leanness and healthy weight and a reduction in risk of metabolic disease. Right. Then the other component of a healthy microbiome and a lean microbiome is having high levels of Bifidobacterium species, right? High levels of Bifidobacterium in the large bowel is inversely correlated with body weight. We also know that mice, again, fed high fat diet, the amount, and then engrafted with Bifidobacterium. Now, keep in mind that it's easier to put a live probiotic into a mouse because they can do a gavage, right? You can actually stick the probiotic way deep into the digestive tract of the mouse through a gavage. So it's easier to do this with mice than it is with humans. But it was shown to reduce liver triglycerides, total cholesterol, total lipid deposition, and body weight gain. Right. So just adding in this microbe seems to improve metabolic health quite a bit. One of the ways in which it does it is Bifidobacteria tends to be a good producer of CLA. CLA is conjugated linoleic acid. There's a number of CLAs out in the market for weight loss and metabolic health because it's been shown in these animal studies starting that CLAs have a way of triggering fat burn and reducing inflammation from an elevation of lipids in the body. It also increases the production of short chain fatty acids and GLP-1, right? So short chain fatty acids are butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Butyrate, in particular, when elevated or when at good levels, controls blood sugar, controls energy balance in the body, and stimulates fat burning, right? So butyrate is incredibly important for metabolic health. And those with good production of butyrate in their gut tend to be very lean, tend to have low inflammation, and tend to be protected against metabolic disease. Those that tend to be obese struggle with making butyrate in their large bowel. Now, a lot of people are now familiar with GLP-1, right? Glucagon-like peptide 1. There's this new drug called Ozempic, right? Which is semaglutide, which is another name for it. These are GLP-1 agonists. GLP-1 is a protein expressed by cells in your intestines called L cells. It's expressed based on incoming dietary input and also by certain types of bacteria in your gut. When GLP-1 is expressed, it induces metabolic control on sugar, and it controls appetite, and it controls digestive transition. So you actually feel full for longer. This is one of the key things that reduces appetite in individuals. And then it also controls metabolic processes. So fat burning, utilization of sugar properly, and so on. This is why this semaglutide and Ozempic, these GLP-1 agonists, these peptides have become so popular, because they're now the new hot weight loss drug, right? But your microbiome has the ability to upregulate GLP-1 if you have a pro-lean microbiome, which means you have good levels of Akkermansia, you have good levels of bifidobacteria, right? Now, there are certain lactobacillus species that also play an important role in being lean. And in particular, it's because they also produce conjugated linoleic acids, which have been shown to burn fat and reduce inflammation in humans and in animals. And low CLA production, based on dietary sources, is associated with obesity and dysfunctional metabolic processes, right? So being able to produce enough CLAs in the gut is a really important thing. And there's some lactobacillus species that show that. Dietary CLAs are typically absorbed in the small bowel, so you can take them as a supplement. But the large intestine CLAs has to be generated by the microbes in the gut. So you could take CLAs as a supplementation. It may help with obesity, with weight management and metabolic health. But at the end of the day, you want to get a lot of endogenous production of CLA in the large bowel. You want to get a lot of endogenous production of short chain fatty acids. You want to activate GLP-1 naturally, and you want to activate a couple other systems, one called cyclic AMP and another one called AMPK. These are also things that are activated in the large bowel by the presence of butyrate made by bacteria, that then go on to control sugar, control inflammation, control metabolic processes, including fat burning in the system, right? So if you just imagine two individuals, one that doesn't have these features, they have low Akkermansia, low bifidobacterium, low levels of lactobacilli, especially the ones that make CLA in your gut. When those individuals eat food, compared to someone next to them that, let's say, is lean and has really good levels of bifidobacteria, really good levels of Akkermansia, really good levels of lactobacillus, and produces high levels of short chain fatty acids. When both those individuals eat food, right? Food, as it passes through the stomach, gets acidified and starts the digestion process, goes into the small bowel, goes through the digestion and assimilation process, enzymes breaking down macromolecules into micromolecules, amino acids and all getting absorbed, glucose getting absorbed, fructose getting absorbed, fatty acids getting absorbed. Then the rest of the food goes into the large intestine, where in the individual with a pro-obese microbiome, it's not being converted into butyrate. The food's not is not activating GLP-1. It's not activating AMPK and so on. So then their satiety signals aren't being kicked off. They still feel hungry, even though they've eaten an adequate amount of nutrition. The food dumps into the large bowel. It sits there, it ferments, but it doesn't produce the right things because they don't have the right bacteria. So they're not activating the satiety and hormones. They're continuing to produce hormones that are associated with hunger, like ghrelin. And they're not controlling blood sugar. Blood sugar is rising from the sugars that they're absorbing, and that they absorb in the small intestine. They continue to perhaps absorb, and then their fat burn is basically turned off, because now the body's like, oh my God, we have a lot of sugar. We have to produce as much insulin as we can. We got to try to control the amount of sugar in the blood, and then they're in a sugar breakdown process. They're not fat burning at all, and they're not satiated. They're continuing to feel hungry. They'll continue to eat more. In the other individual that has a pro-lean microbiome, when the food dumps into the large bowel, much of it is being converted into these short chain fatty acids, which then activate things like the leptin, which then reduces hunger and increases satiety, right? So now those individuals are like, okay, I'm full. I don't need to eat anymore. They feel the actual satiation of food. They no longer have a desire to eat. So they stop eating. They don't take in excessive amounts of calories. And then, because of the production of short chain fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acids, their body goes into this sugar control fat burning mode. So insulin is released as needed to bring sugar into the cells and get it metabolized and used, or converted to storage form called glycogen in your muscles or in your liver. And then the rest of the body goes into fat burning mode. So you're no longer hungry, you're not eating anymore, and your body's turned on this massive fat burning machine. Right. So that's the same exact meal for both of those individuals with a completely different response in those individuals. Right. And so for the first person with the pro-obese microbiome, it takes so much more for that individual to lose weight because they have appetite control issues. They're not burning fat efficiently. They've got poor glucose control. They've got high degrees of inflammation. And because their microbiome's messed up, they probably have high stress and anxiety as well, which actually screws up your metabolism even more. So they've got a confounding of issues that keeps them in this metabolic distress. Right, this individual here, it's much easier for the other individual, the pro-lean microbiome individual, to stay lean, to burn fat, to build muscle, to activate myokines through the microbiome, to activate muscle building, to assimilate nutrients, to feel full, not overeat. All of these things are working the way it should work in these individuals. Right. So short chain fatty acids are really a key component of here. These particular specifics like protein coupled receptors, GPR41 and 43, that are found on fat cells get activated by short chain fatty acids, which stimulates the production of leptin, which is a satiety hormone. Right. So that's what I mentioned in the previous slide. This is showing you how it's done. Right. So you produce short chain fatty acids by these beneficial microbes like Bifidobacterium, like Fecalum bacterium, like Akkermansia, and then that activates the satiety signals. They also upregulate AMPK, which I mentioned, which is an enzyme that monitors cellular energy and upregulates fat burn so that you can improve cellular energy throughout the body. And in obesity, those with low short chain fatty acids tend to have less of this satiety signaling and less of this fat burn capability. Right. And their livers also tend to go through more toxicity. Their leaky gut tends to be much more profound. So they have chronic low-grade inflammation, and they can't produce the metabolic control mechanisms as well as individuals who have a pro-lean microbiome. So that's really the key. And this leaky gut issue is really at the root of it, because then you have the lipopolysaccharide, which we talked about last time, that endotoxin that leaks through in people with leaky gut. Not only do they not have the right microbes in abundance to control appetite, fat burning, and all that, they also have chronic low-grade inflammation. And one of the things that happens with LPS, and this is where it really drives the obesity-related disease risk, right? So keep in mind that we've known for a long time now that being obese increased your disease risk in almost every category, right? More than double the increase for heart disease, almost 3 to 4 times increase in risk of diabetes, 2.5, 3 times increase in Alzheimer's and dementia, increase in autoimmune conditions. So being obese dramatically increases your risk for any other disease state. Why was the big question, right? We know the association, but then the question is, what about being obese drove a lot of these other disease risks? And as it turns out, it's the chronic low-grade inflammation. And it's the chronic low-grade inflammation that made the individuals obese to begin with. And they continue to maintain that chronic low-grade inflammation as they continue to increase in obesity. right? And that chronic low-grade inflammation comes from a leaky gut and LPS. The American Diabetic Association published studies showing that leaky gut was the primary insult in the establishment of obesity and type 2 diabetes, right? So
Mm.
these individuals' guts were leaky to begin with, and then that made them obese and then gave them glucose control issues and all that. And that continues to be an underlying factor, because one of the things that occurs, which I'll skip through this, is, oh, as I mentioned here, so metabolic endotoxemia, this is published by the American Diabetic Association, initiates obesity and insulin resistance, and then those endotoxins leak through when it's leaking. If you look here on the top right-hand corner, this LPS, the box that has LPS above, these are fat cells. These are fat cells under a microscope as they interact with this endotoxin that leaks through in leaky gut. The fat cells, when they interact with the LPS endotoxins, triple in volume,
Mm.
right? So imagine your gut is leaky, you eat food, a bunch of endotoxins leaks through. Of course, you're not producing short chain fatty acids and CLA, you're not activating the satiety signals, you're not activating the fat burning signals, and so on. And on top of that, these endotoxins leak in, they interact with the fat cells in your midsection, and it swells the fat cells almost to 3 times their normal volume,
Wow.
dramatically increasing the volume or adiposity in many of these individuals, right? And that same LPS also creates insulin resistance in individuals, causing then diabetes and so on. That's why obesity and diabetes kind of goes hand in hand. So there's lots of studies that show this. And then ultimately, there's 2 things to think about: leptin resistance. Leptin is a satiety hormone, right? That's the hormone that's supposed to increase when you get enough food from a meal to satiate your body's needs. Then the ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone, starts to dissipate, and leptin, the satiety hormone, goes up. That change is controlled by your microbiome, right? And so if you don't have the right microbes in your microbiome, your body does not respond appropriately with leptin when you eat food, and thereby you keep eating because the satiety signals aren't working that well. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, continuously is expressed in these individuals, right? And I see this with like kids, for example. My kids who are metabolically healthy, their leptin and ghrelin signals work really well, even foods that they absolutely love, right? Like take a, like pizza or donuts or something like that, right? Just bad things at a birthday party or something like that. They'll eat a piece of cake until they're satiated. And sometimes it might be a third of that piece or half of that piece. And when they're done, right?
Yeah.
They can push it away. They go, oh, I don't want any more, right? And so, but an adult will more often than not find that difficult. If we have a piece of cake, we're probably going to finish the whole thing, even though we don't need it and our body doesn't need it. But kids are actually really good when their leptin and ghrelin function works really well. They can push things away. The satiety signals are very strong in that once you're done eating, you're done. Food is no longer attractive. It no longer satiates you. Your satiation is high.